How many of you have read or watched The Hunger Games? Okay, that's pretty much everybody. Well, that means you have read or watched one of the most popular dystopian science fiction works today. Now, some of you might still be wondering why I'm talking about this, what exactly is dystopian science fiction, why does any of it matter? To answer that first question, why I'm discussing this, we have to look at one of the biggest science fiction franchises, Star Trek. Anybody who knows me personally knows that I'm a shameless Trekkie. I grew up watching Star Trek and I love the show. It's quite a big franchise. If we just look at the TV shows alone, there are about 10 series that have been broadcast on television or in streaming services. This doesn't even include the comics, the movies, and other expanded universe materials. But this massive franchise started as a single TV show broadcast in the 1960s, called the original series. This show focused on the adventures of Captain Kirk, played by William Shatner, sat in the center, and his crew on a starship called the Enterprise, a human society that is now known as the Federation in the future. The show was notable for a lot of reasons. The first being that it was one of the first television shows in the West to ever show a protagonist of color, who's Lieutenant Uhura, the woman in the background. She was one of the first Black women on television in the West to have a protagonist role. Alongside her, we also have Sulu and Chekhov, who are from Japan and Russia respectively, two countries which at the time had very tense relations with the United States due to the events of the Second World War and the Cold War. In this way, Star Trek was quite a utopian and idealistic series, because the Federation, human society in other words, alongside gender and racial equality, was also free of poverty, free of disease, free of hunger, and also notably had no concept of money. This meant that humans were largely free to do whatever they wanted with their free time, and many people still chose to advance society. This meant that Star Trek and the Federation in general was a very utopian piece of science fiction. This was a characteristic of both the show and the society within Star Trek that stayed consistent until the third installment in the 1990s. This was a show called Deep Space Nine. While Deep Space Nine still had a utopian Federation society, it was notably darker than previous installments as it dealt with themes such as genocide, corruption, and the horrors of war. Though I don't agree with the sentiment necessarily, it is thus understandable that a lot of people felt that this was a start of darkness within the Star Trek franchise. But for me, an important distinction to make is that all of these problems, such as government corruption and genocide, were present in the alien societies encountered by the crew of Deep Space Nine, and not present within the Federation itself. The reason I make this distinction was because in 2020, with one of the newer series called Star Trek Picard, we see that the Federation went from this utopian society to society with a cybernetic organ black market. The Federation itself had become morally bankrupt and corrupt. In previous installments, characters fought for the rights of cybernetic and artificial life forms such as robots and androids. As we can see here, Lieutenant Commander Data, who was an android, had his rights defended by his captain in a trial that determined that he was not the property of the Federation's military. So in other words, we have a very utopian franchise and society turned distinctly dystopian. And this was a change that angered and upset a lot of long-term fans of the show. One fan, in reaction to Star Trek Picard, even said, "Does our society hate itself so much that it cannot conceive of an optimistic future?" And this got me thinking. We don't really have optimistic science fiction shows anymore, or science fiction franchises, and this, I think, is a problem. But before you can really understand why, we have to look at how dystopian science fiction has become so mainstream and so popular. So first, what is dystopian science fiction? Dystopian science fiction is a genre that generally aims to criticize modern-day trends by using a futuristic and technologically advanced setting. We can see this in classic dystopian science fiction works such as 1984, published by George Orwell in 1939, where we see a society where the government has the technology and means to watch us all the time. We can also see this in a more recent dystopian work, The Hunger Games, where we see an advanced society that's very greedy and uses the death of children in a game show-like fashion for entertainment. If we look briefly at the history of dystopian science fiction, how it became popular, however, we have to look all the way back to 1908, with the publication of this book called The Iron Heel. Though the book was purely fiction at the time that it was published, it was later seen to be a very accurate prediction of the events of the First World War. There were steady contributions to the genre over the decades, with publications such as 1984, like I mentioned earlier, and Fahrenheit 451, published in the US in 1953. In this book, we see the dangers of government censorship and willful ignorance by looking at a society where books are not only banned but regularly burned by government institutions. If we go back to Star Trek as an example with Star Trek Picard, we can see the dangers of racism and xenophobia by looking at one of the alien societies in the show called the Romulans, who are very racist and xenophobic themselves. So in this way, we see dystopian does have some practical uses and applications. I also argue that dystopian science fiction is a part of a wider phenomenon called infotainment. The theory of infotainment is that our traditional news sources and media are becoming less and less serious as time goes on, instead focusing on flashy graphics and comedic delivery. In other words, it aims to not just inform, but also entertain. The reverse of this, I argue, is that our fiction correspondingly becomes more and more serious and more dystopian. In this way, we don't feel psychologically burdened by realities that we feel we cannot change that we would normally see in the news, but we can still critically engage with these kinds of issues by looking at dystopian science fiction and still feel that we are critically engaged in it without burdening ourselves psychologically. And in this way, we see dystopian science fiction, once again, has its uses, and I'm not trying to say we should discard of it or that we don't need it at all. What I am saying is that we need a counterpart to it, or a counterbalance, in utopian and idealistic science fiction. But to understand why, we should look at what science fiction is as a genre and what it can achieve. So why is science fiction special? And I mean it, it really is a special genre. Science fiction shows things that humans could potentially achieve in the future, based on things that are theoretically achievable right now. You might wonder how this might make it different from fantasy, where humans also achieve the impossible. Though they are conceptually very similar, I argue that they're very different. An opinion that I agree with is that while humans achieve the impossible in both genres, in fantasy, humans do so through magic, which is something that will never exist and that we can never access. Science fiction, on the other hand, is based on technology that is either available now in its early stages or is theoretically achievable in the future. And in this way, we see science fiction as a window into our potential. And if even this place where we see the pinnacle of human achievement says that we are always going to be inherently evil, destructive, manipulative, and greedy beings, where is the hope for us? Think about for a moment where we would be without more optimistic science fiction series like Star Trek. Notably, a lot of people of color were inspired by Star Trek to achieve more than what society said they could. A famous example would be Whoopi Goldberg, who would later go to act in Star Trek herself, who said that she was inspired by seeing Lieutenant Uhura act more than somebody's maid. This was during a time where this kind of idea or dream for Black women in America seemed like an impossibility, where racial and gender equality seemed like an insane fantasy. So without utopian science fiction, where are we supposed to get our hope to deal with these immense global challenges that we're being bombarded with every day? Think about it, for people my age and younger, we are constantly being told about things like the current pandemic, the incredibly competitive job market, economic recession, and climate change. All realities that seem like we have no power whatsoever to fix. And even our fiction, where we're supposed to draw our hope and inspiration from, says that we can't do it. How are we supposed to think of ways to look at these global challenges and much less innovate or invent and try to come up with a way to overcome these obstacles that we face? Does our society hate itself so much that it cannot conceive of an optimistic future? And I would like to end this with a sentence I've always wanted to say. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk.